He found her at his father's graveside, a stranger she'd been visiting every week for 20 years, and she told him a secret that dismantled his entire world. She was the one who cooked his meals, who made sure he took his medicine, who held his hand when he took his final breath. His family had abandoned him, but she never did. Her name was Dorothy. For 2 decades, she was the invisible safety net for a man his own children forgot. This is the story of the secret caregivers who step in when families step out, and the profound debt that goes unseen and unpaid. So what happens when that hidden ledger is finally opened? The old man was Arthur Chen, a self-made millionaire who built a real estate empire from nothing. And by the time he turned 80, he was utterly alone. His wife had passed a decade earlier. His 3 children, including his eldest son Michael, who now ran the company, were scattered across the globe, busy, successful, and entirely absent. Arthur's decline was slow, then sudden, a minor stroke that left him with a lingering tremor, then a diabetes diagnosis that required strict management. The family's solution was to throw money at the problem. They moved him into a luxury assisted living facility, the kind with chandeliers in the lobby and a waiting list for celebrities. They paid $12,000 a month, and they believed that was enough. But hear what the brochures don't show you. Facilities like that are designed for independence, not for the creeping fog of dementia. Arthur began to wander. He'd forget his medication. He'd become agitated, calling out for children who never called back. Within 6 months, he was deemed too high needs. The facility politely and legally asked him to leave. This is called graduating in the industry, and it happens every single day. Michael, the son, was in Singapore closing a deal. He authorized a move to a more clinical, skilled nursing facility. But Arthur's paperwork, lost in the shuffle, showed a history of difficult behavior. Beds were suddenly full. There was a waiting period. For 2 weeks, Arthur existed in a limbo of hospital discharge planners and urgent family conferences that happened over speakerphone. This is the exact moment the system is designed to fail. This is the crack where people fall through, and this is where Dorothy found him. Dorothy Miller was 62 years old, a retired home health aide who lived in the same modest neighborhood where Arthur had bought his first duplex 50 years prior. She'd seen him around for decades, this proud, quiet Chinese man who always tipped the mail carrier at Christmas. She was at the hospital visiting a friend when she saw Arthur, confused and alone in a wheelchair by the nurse's station, being told there was no placement for him. She didn't have to stop, but she did. She asked the nurse what was happening, and the nurse, overwhelmed and cynical, muttered the truth. Families MIA waiting on a bed probably end up in some state-funded hellhole. Dorothy looked at Arthur. He was clutching a faded photo of his late wife, and she made a decision that would redefine the next 20 years of her life. She told the social worker she was a distant cousin. She used her old professional credentials to vouch for his care, and she took Arthur Chen home, not to her house but to his own empty house which the family had kept but never visited. She believed he'd do better in familiar surroundings. She believed it was temporary. But temporary became permanent. The family's checks for the facility kept coming. Michael's assistant auto-paid the bills. No one noticed the payments were going to an account that Dorothy, with a reluctant lawyer's help, had Arthur set up for household expenses. It wasn't theft, it was survival. She used that money to buy groceries, to pay for his medications, to hire a part-time nurse so she could sleep. For the first 5 years it was manageable. Arthur had good days. He'd recognize Dorothy, call her by name, thank her for her kindness. She'd find old photo albums and he'd tell stories about building his business. She learned about his children, Michael, the driven eldest, Lisa, the artist in Paris, David, the surgeon in Boston. She'd prompt him to call them. Sometimes he'd try. More often than not, he'd get a voicemail. As the dementia tightened its grip, Dorothy's role transformed. She was no longer just a caretaker. She was his gatekeeper, his memory, his tether to reality. She bathed him, she fed him, she held him through the night terrors. She celebrated his birthdays with a cupcake, just the two of them in that quiet, echoing house. And the family, they called on holidays. Brief, cheerful conversations where Arthur, coached by Dorothy, would say he was fine, that the facility was treating him well. They sent flowers on his birthday. They were ghosts in his life, pale reflections on a screen. Dorothy kept a journal, not out of malice but as a medical log. Entries like June 14th, Arthur fell trying to get to the bathroom. No injury but scared, sat with him for 3 hours. Or December 3rd, he asked for his son Michael 12 times today. I called Michael's office. The assistant said he was in meetings and would call back. He never did. The economic reality was staggering. The market rate for 24/7 in-home care, over $200,000 a year for 2 decades, a $4 million debt of care. Dorothy was paid nothing. She lived on her small pension and the modest household account. Her own retirement was spent caring for another man's father. Then the turning point, a massive stroke. Arthur was hospitalized. This time the hospital contacted the next of kin directly. Michael Chen, now a powerful CEO in his own right, flew in. He was met by a doctor who said his father was dying and that he had been brought from his private home, not a facility. Michael was confused. He went to his father's house to get some personal effects for the hospital room, and he found Dorothy there packing a bag. He didn't know who she was. He assumed she was a housekeeper, maybe a squatter. He was polite but cold. "I'll take it from here," he said. Dorothy, exhausted from 3 nights sleeping in a hospital chair, simply handed him the bag. She said, "He'll want his own pajamas, the blue ones, and the photo of your mother is already in there." The familiarity stopped him cold. Who was this black woman who knew such intimate details? He went to the hospital. His father lingered for 2 days, and in those 2 days Michael saw a parade of nurses, aides, and even the hospital chaplain greet Dorothy by name. They asked *her* about Arthur's medical history. They looked to *her* for decisions. His father's hand, when conscious, reached for hers. Michael was a spectator in his own father's death. Arthur Chen passed away on a Tuesday morning. Dorothy was holding one hand. Michael, having just arrived, held the other. The silence that followed was not just the absence of a heartbeat, it was the weight of a truth about to break. The funeral was a lavish corporate affair. Michael gave a eulogy about his father's legacy. His siblings flew in and out within 24 hours. It was a week later, when Michael returned alone to the gravesite, that he found her. Dorothy in her modest coat, placing fresh flowers on the bare earth. He asked her finally the question that had been burning in him for days. "Who are you to him?" And she told him about the 20 years, about the missed calls, about the loneliness, about the love she had for a man who was not her father. She didn't accuse, she just stated facts. And with each one, Michael Chen's world, the world of board meetings and quarterly reports and filial piety, cracked open. He asked her why she did it, and Dorothy looked at the tombstone, then back at him, and said the words that would haunt him forever. "Because someone had to, and you weren't here." But that wasn't the secret, that was just the beginning, because then Dorothy reached into her purse, and she pulled out a worn, leather-bound book, Arthur's private journal kept in his lucid moments. She handed it to the son and said, "He wrote this for you, all of it. I think you need to read what he really felt." And as Michael Chen, the powerful boss, took his father's final words from the hands of a stranger, he had no idea that the first page contained a sentence that would unravel his entire legacy and ignite a legal battle that would expose the multi-billion-dollar shadow economy of secret caregivers. Michael opened the journal that night in his penthouse. The first entry was dated 20 years ago, the week after his mother's funeral, and the first line was a dagger: "My children have buried their mother and forgotten their father." What followed was a 20-year chronicle of abandonment, written in the shaky hand of a man watching his own family vanish, page after page of quiet devastation. Michael called today. He talked for 3 minutes about a deal in Dubai. He did not ask how I was. Lisa's assistant sent a Christmas hamper. I have no way to cook a ham. David's number is disconnected, again. But halfway through the journal, the tone shifted. The entries began to include another name, Dorothy. Dorothy brought soup today. She remembered it was May's recipe. Dorothy fixed the leak under the sink. She said a man shouldn't live with a dripping sound. I fell today. Dorothy found me. She did not scold. She just helped me up and made tea. Arthur's writing about Dorothy was not just gratitude. It was love, a deep, profound, and entirely platonic love built on the bedrock of daily kindness. And then 3 years before his death, Arthur had written the sentence that would change everything. "I have amended my will. I cannot leave my children money they do not need and will not miss. I leave them my lesson, and I leave Dorothy what she is owed, the house, everything in it, and a trust to care for her as she cared for me. Let them contest it. They will have to look me in the eye in a courtroom and explain why they deserve $1. Michael read the sentence 5 times. The house, the entire $4 million property in a now hip neighborhood, left to a stranger. His first reaction was not grief or guilt. It was pure incandescent rage. He called his lawyer at midnight. This was the spark, but the tinder had been laid decades earlier in a legal gray zone few families ever see. What Dorothy had done was not just kindness, it was gratuitous caregiving, a legal term for services provided without a contract, without expectation of payment, out of affection or moral obligation. And in many states, the law allows such caregivers to make a claim against the estate. They can sue for quantum merit, the reasonable value of services rendered. Michael's lawyer, a sleek estate litigator named Robert Thorne, laid out the cold reality the next morning. She has a case, a strong one. The journal is evidence of the family's abandonment and her sustained care. She lived with him for 20 years. The court could see her as a de facto family member. They could award her the house plus the value of her care. We're talking about $5–6 million total. Michael was apoplectic. She's a con artist. She preyed on a sick old man, but Thorne was unmoved. The journal says otherwise. Your father was of sound mind when he wrote most of this. A handwriting expert will confirm it, and she has her own logs, Michael. Meticulous records of every doctor's appointment, every medication, every night she stayed over. This isn't a hobby. This was a full-time job she performed for free. The battle lines were drawn in the most sterile of places, a probate court filing. Michael Chen, as executor of the Arthur Chen estate, filed to invalidate the will, claiming his father was unduly influenced by a predatory caregiver. It was a common tactic. It was also the first step in a war that would drag Dorothy Miller's private life into the brutal light of day. Dorothy was served papers at her small apartment. She had moved out of Arthur's house after his death, taking only a few photos and his favorite teacup. She had no money for a lawyer, but the story, leaking from the courthouse, found its way to a different kind of attorney. Elena Rodriguez, a fierce advocate for elder rights and unpaid caregivers, took the case pro bono. She saw it as a landmark opportunity. Elena's first move was not a legal filing. It was a public relations missile. She held a press conference with Dorothy by her side. She laid out the timeline, the journal entries, the stark math of care. For 20 years, Elena said, Dorothy Miller provided care this family valued at $0. Now they want to give her exactly that. We are not just fighting for a house. We are fighting for the recognition that this labor has value, that love has a ledger. The story went viral, not as a local oddity but as a national Rorschach test. Comment sections exploded. Some saw Dorothy as a saint, others called her a schemer. The phrase granny dumping trended on social media. Reporters dug into the statistics, revealing the shocking scale of the shadow economy Arthur and Dorothy represented. They found that an estimated 70,000 elderly Americans are abandoned or dumped each year. They found that the value of unpaid caregiving by people like Dorothy, neighbors, friends, distant relatives, topped $470 billion annually. That's more than the entire budget of the Medicaid program. This was not a singular tragedy. It was a systemic failure playing out in millions of quiet homes. The pressure on Michael was now twofold, legal and reputational. News outlets dug into his lavish lifestyle, contrasting his skyscraper office views with the image of his father alone in a dark house. His company's board grew nervous. Partners asked uncomfortable questions. In a desperate move to regain control, Michael and his siblings did the one thing they'd avoided for 20 years. They sat down with Dorothy. It was not a reconciliation. It was a settlement negotiation mediated by a retired judge. Lisa, the artist, cried. David, the surgeon, was defensive. Michael was coldly analytical. He opened with an offer, $250,000, a thank you gift, no admission of liability. Dorothy would sign an NDA and go away. Dorothy, who had been silent, looked at the three middle-aged strangers who shared Arthur's blood, and she said, I didn't do it for money, I did it because he was a person, and he was lonely. Then Elena, her lawyer, slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was an invoice. Itemized, Elena said calmly, 20 years of in-home care, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at the market rate for skilled nursing care in this state, adjusted for inflation with overtime for holidays. We've deducted the value of the household account funds you provided for his upkeep. The net balance due to Dorothy Miller is $4,218,000. The room froze. Michael laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. You're insane. But Elena wasn't finished. Alternatively, we can proceed to trial, where we will enter into evidence not just the journal, but the testimony of the hospital staff, the neighbors, the mail carrier who watched your father decline and this woman hold him together. We will put your father's loneliness on display for a jury. We will make you explain under oath why you never visited. We will ask the court to award Dorothy the house and the back pay. And we will ask for punitive damages for emotional distress. We are prepared to argue that your neglect constituted elder abuse, which in this state allows for treble damages. Do you want to do the math on that, Mr. Chen? This was the pivot. This was no longer about a single will. This was about putting a price tag on a lifetime of invisible labor and forcing the world to pay it. The family stormed out. The mediation collapsed. That night, Michael, driven by a mix of fury and curiosity, did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to his father's old neighborhood. He parked down the block from the house he grew up in. He saw the light on in the living room, and he saw through the window Dorothy Miller. She was not alone. She was sitting with two other people, an elderly white man in a wheelchair and a tired-looking younger woman. They were in the living room talking. Michael watched, hidden by the night, as Dorothy made tea, as she adjusted the man's blanket, as she listened with a patience that seemed infinite. He realized with a jolt that she was doing it again. She was caring for someone else's abandoned father. He called his lawyer from the car. Who is she? Really? Thorne, having done a deeper dive, revealed the truth. Dorothy Miller had no living family. Her only son had died young. She had spent 30 years as a home health aide before retiring, and then instead of resting, she had informally adopted half a dozen isolated seniors in her neighborhood over the years, checking in on them, shopping for them, sitting with them. Arthur was just the one she couldn't let go of. She's not a con artist, Thorne said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. She's a one-woman social safety net, and you're trying to criminalize her for it. This was the crack in Michael's anger, but before it could widen, his sister Lisa, the artist in Paris, called in a panic. Her gallery opening had been picketed. Protesters held signs with Arthur's photo and the words, "Where were you?" David, the surgeon, received a formal inquiry from his hospital's ethics board, prompted by an anonymous complaint about familial neglect. The family's private failure was now a public spectacle, and the legal discovery process was about to make it worse. Elena Rodriguez subpoenaed everything: phone records showing the infrequency of calls, flight manifests proving they were in the same city but didn't visit, the family's financial records showing millions in spending on luxury goods while Arthur's care fund was a paltry $12,000 a year. The most damning find was an email from Michael to his assistant 5 years prior. The subject line, "Dad's situation." The text read, "Just keep the payments to the facility auto-drafting. Don't bother me with the details unless he dies. I'm swamped." That email was a gift to Dorothy's legal team. It was direct evidence of willful neglect. It showed that Michael didn't just fail to care, he actively chose not to know. As the trial date loomed, Michael faced a choice. He could fight and risk having that email read aloud in court, plastered across the internet, forever tied to his name, or he could settle. But to settle meant admitting Dorothy was right. It meant validating her 2 decades of labor. It meant rewriting the story of his father's final years and his own role as the villain. He requested one more meeting with Dorothy, just the two of them. No lawyers. She agreed on the condition it be at the cemetery. They stood again at Arthur's grave, the same place this had started. Michael didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Did he hate me?" Dorothy looked at the tombstone. "He loved you, he just missed you every single day." That was the truth that broke Michael Chen. Not the legal threat, not the public shamming. The simple, unbearable fact that his father's love had been a constant, waiting for him, and he had been too busy to collect it. He said, "What do you want, truly?" Dorothy's answer was not about money. "I want you to understand what you lost, and I want you to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Your father's house, turn it into a respite center for people like me, for the neighbors who are keeping other people's parents alive. Give them a place to sleep, a hot meal, some help." That's what he would have wanted. This was the bridge, the moment the battle transformed from destruction to legacy. Michael agreed on the spot. He would drop the challenge to the will. He would sign over the house to a non-profit in his father's name with Dorothy as its director. He would fund it with an endowment, and he would pay Dorothy a settlement, not the $4 million, but enough to secure her own retirement. They shook hands over Arthur Chen's grave. It felt like an ending. But it wasn't, because when Michael took the settlement proposal to his siblings, David the surgeon refused, vehemently. He saw it as capitulation, as theft, and he had a secret of his own, a piece of information he'd been holding back that would not just derail the settlement, but expose a crime hidden within Arthur Chen's final, quiet years. David's secret was a single piece of paper, a lab report from the hospital dated 2 days before their father died. It showed toxic levels of a pain medication in Arthur Chen's system, a medication he wasn't prescribed, and David, the surgeon, knew exactly where it came from. He'd found it in the medical file a month after the funeral. He'd assumed it was a hospital error, a tragic but common mistake. He'd buried it, not wanting to complicate the grief or the estate. But now, with Michael ready to hand over the house to Dorothy, David saw a weapon. "Think about it," he told his siblings in a frantic conference call. She had 24/7 access. She managed his medications. The journal says he was in pain. What if she was easing his suffering a little too much? What if she helped him along to secure her inheritance? The accusation was monstrous, but in the context of a bitter legal war, it was incendiary. David didn't believe it, not really, but he was willing to use it. He threatened to take the report to the district attorney if Michael didn't pull out of the settlement and fight Dorothy to the bitter end. This was no longer about neglect. This was about potential murder. Michael was horrified, but a colder, more calculating part of his mind engaged. If David went to the authorities, everything would freeze. The estate, the house, the settlement, all would be locked in probate during a criminal investigation. Dorothy would be publicly branded a suspect. Her reputation, her legacy would be ashes. It was the nuclear option. Michael called Elena Rodriguez, Dorothy's lawyer, and requested an emergency meeting. This time he didn't mince words. He told her about the lab report. He told her David's threat. He watched as the color drained from Elena's face. Elena's response was immediate and ferocious. "If you so much as whisper that accusation publicly, we will countersue for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress so vicious it will make your head spin. We will subpoena every medical record, every nurse, every doctor, and we will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt where that medication really came from." Then she dropped her own bomb. "You think we didn't do our own due diligence? We have the complete pharmaceutical log from the last 5 years of your father's life. Every pill, every prescription, every refill, and we know who was picking them up." She produced a spreadsheet. It showed a pattern. Every 3 months, a prescription for oxycodone, a powerful opioid, was filled at a pharmacy across town. Under the name Arthur Chen, the prescribing doctor was listed as a Dr. Evan Walsh. The person picking it up was not Dorothy, it was a man named James Kowalski. Michael had never heard the name. Elena explained. James Kowalski was a former orderly from the first luxury facility that had graduated Arthur. He'd been fired for stealing medications, but he'd kept a copy of Arthur's chart, and for years he'd been using Arthur's identity to run a small-time prescription drug ring. He'd write scripts using Dr. Walsh's stolen pad, fill them, and sell the pills on the street. Dorothy had discovered it 2 years earlier. She'd found a pill bottle in Arthur's bathroom that she didn't recognize. She called the pharmacy, then the doctor's office, and unraveled the scam. She'd confronted James, threatened to call the police. He begged her not to, saying he'd stop. And like so many caregivers faced with a chaotic problem, she'd prioritized Arthur's immediate peace over a legal battle. She'd flushed the pills and changed Arthur's pharmacy, thinking it was over. But it wasn't over. James Kowalski, it turned out, had a partner, someone with higher-level access, someone who could alter hospital records after the fact. Elena laid it out. The toxic medication in Arthur's system at death was the same oxycodone from the fake prescriptions, but Arthur hadn't taken it. The hospital's own security footage, which Elena had obtained, showed a familiar face entering Arthur's room the night before the lab was drawn, David Chen. David, the surgeon, had flown in a day earlier than he'd told his siblings. He'd gone to the hospital alone, and he'd brought his own medical bag. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. David, drowning in medical school debt and alimony, had been James Kowalski's silent partner for years. He provided the medical credentials to make the fraud work, taking a cut of the profits. When Arthur was hospitalized and David realized the paper trail might lead back to him, he'd panicked. He'd administered a fatal dose to his own father, framing the impending death on the overmedication from Dorothy's care. He'd planned to use the lab report to discredit her if he ever needed to. He never imagined he'd need it to stop his brother from giving away his inheritance. The bridge handshake at the cemetery hadn't been a redemption, it had been a trigger. David saw his cash cow, the estate, being given away, and he pulled the trigger on his contingency plan. Michael was shattered. The moral failure of neglect was one thing, but this was a direct, premeditated act of evil. His brother had killed their father, and he was trying to pin it on the woman who loved him. Elena presented Michael with a choice. You can take this to the police right now. Your brother will be arrested for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Your family name will be dragged through the mud in a trial that will make the O.J. Simpson case look tame. Arthur's legacy will be a true crime documentary. Or, she said, her voice dropping, we handle it another way. The other way was a silent, brutal coup. Using the evidence they had, Elena and Michael confronted David privately. They played him the security footage. They showed him the financial trail linking him to Kowalski's accounts. They gave him 48 hours to resign from the hospital, sign over his share of the inheritance to the non-profit, and leave the country. If he did, the evidence would be sealed. If he didn't, it would go to the district attorney and the medical board. David, faced with the ruin of his life and the prospect of life in prison, folded. He signed the papers. He left for Switzerland the next day, telling his colleagues he was pursuing a sabbatical. He would never practice medicine again. The cost of this silence was immense. Michael had to live with the knowledge that his brother was a murderer who walked free. Dorothy had to live with the knowledge that the man she cared for was killed by his own son, and that justice would never be publicly served. But the settlement could now proceed. The Arthur Chen House for Respite Care was officially established. Dorothy moved back into the house, this time as its director. The endowment was funded. The first families, exhausted, unpaid caregivers like Dorothy began to arrive, getting a week of rest while their loved ones were cared for. The story seemed to have reached its conclusion, a bittersweet victory built on a hidden tragedy. The media reported it as a heartwarming tale of reconciliation and legacy. Michael gave interviews about the importance of family and elder care. Dorothy was celebrated as a local hero. But the system that created this tragedy remained unchanged, and it was about to exact a price from the one person who thought she was finally safe. 6 months after the house opened, Dorothy received a certified letter. It was from the state's Department of Health and Human Services. It was a notice of investigation. A complaint had been filed alleging that she had practiced nursing without a license for 20 years, that she had administered medications without authorization, and that she had fraudulently represented herself as a family member to medical personnel. The complaint was detailed. It cited specific instances from Arthur's journals and hospital records. It had been filed anonymously, but the phrasing was legally precise. It bore the hallmarks of someone with medical and legal knowledge. David was in Switzerland, but he had left a final, vengeful trap. He had weaponized the very bureaucracy that had failed Arthur for decades, and now it was coming for Dorothy. The state was moving to shut down the respite house, fine her hundreds of thousands of dollars, and potentially charge her with a felony. The house of cards, built on secret care and quiet sacrifices, was about to be demolished by the letter of the law. And Dorothy Miller, who had spent her life hiding in the shadows to do good, would have to step into the light and fight the entire system, or lose everything she had built and loved. The state's case was a bureaucratic behemoth built to crush individuals. They weren't accusing Dorothy of malice, they were accusing her of stepping outside the lines, and in their world that was the greater crime. Elena Rodriguez saw the trap immediately. David from abroad had used his knowledge of medical and legal systems to file a complaint that was technically accurate. Dorothy had performed nursing tasks without a license. She had represented herself as family to get information. She had done these things because the alternative was letting a man suffer and die alone. But the law does not measure compassion, it measures compliance. The notice gave them 30 days to respond. The respite house, which had just welcomed its third family, was now under threat of closure. The state could freeze its operations, revoke its license, and seize the property. Dorothy's personal assets, her small pension, the settlement from Michael, could be levied to pay fines. Elena's strategy was twofold. First, the legal defense. They would argue necessity and the doctrine of implied agency. They would assert that Dorothy acted as an agent of the family who had abdicated their duty. It was a long shot. The second strategy was the court of public opinion. They would make the state the villain. Michael Chen, for the first time, became an unwavering ally. He understood systems. He knew how to move levers of power. He used his connections to get a meeting with the state's deputy director of health services. He brought Dorothy's journals, Arthur's will, and the financial records showing 20 years of unpaid labor. The deputy director, a weary career bureaucrat named Janet Lowell, listened politely. Then she delivered the killing blow. Mr. Chen, with all due respect, the law is clear. The state cannot condone unlicensed medical care no matter the circumstances. If we make an exception for Ms. Miller, we open the floodgates. What about the next caregiver who harms someone? We can't measure intent, we can only measure certification. It was the institutional answer. The system was designed to prevent harm, but in doing so it criminalized the only help available. Michael left the meeting defeated, but Dorothy, who had been silent, turned to him in the elevator and said, "Then we changed the law." It was an absurd idea. A 62-year-old former aide and a guilt-ridden CEO against the entire state legislature. But they had one weapon, a story that had already captured the public's heart. Elena drafted a bill, the Arthur Chen Caregiver Protection Act. It created a new classification, the designated informal caregiver. It allowed individuals with proper documentation and training to perform basic nursing tasks for a specific, isolated senior if no licensed help was available and the family consented. It provided liability protection and a small stipend. It was a band-aid on a gaping wound, but it was a start. Michael used his fortune to fund a lobbying effort. Dorothy became the public face, testifying before legislative committees. She brought other secret caregivers with her, neighbors, friends, church members, who told their own stories of invisible labor. The media dubbed them the Shadow Army. The opposition was fierce. The nurses' union feared dilution of their profession. Insurance companies worried about liability. Conservative lawmakers called it socialized caregiving. The bill stalled in committee. With the 30-day deadline looming, Elena made a desperate gamble. She filed a lawsuit against the state not to fight the charges but to challenge the constitutionality of the regulations as applied. She argued that by criminalizing Dorothy's actions, the state was effectively condemning Arthur Chen to death by neglect, violating his constitutional right to life. It was a novel, aggressive argument. The judge, an elderly man named William Parsons, agreed to an expedited hearing. The courtroom was packed. The state's attorney presented a dry recitation of statutes. Elena presented a narrative. She put Arthur's journal into evidence. She called the mail carrier, the hospital chaplain, the neighbors. She built a portrait of a man kept alive not by the system but in spite of it. Then she called Michael to the stand. Under oath, he was asked the central question. Mr. Chen, if Dorothy Miller had not done what she did, if she had strictly followed the regulations and not administered medication, not bathed him, not told doctors she was his cousin, what would have happened to your father? Michael looked at Dorothy, then at the judge. His voice broke. He would have died years earlier, alone and in pain. The state's attorney objected. Speculation. But Judge Parsons leaned forward. I'll allow it. It's the heart of the matter, isn't it? In his closing, the state's attorney warned of chaos. Your Honor, we cannot have untrained individuals making medical decisions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Elena stood for her rebuttal. She held up a thick binder. This is the state's own manual on elder care protocol. It is 800 pages long. It requires certifications, licenses, forms, and approvals. Dorothy Miller had a different manual. She then held up Dorothy's simple spiral-bound notebook. This one, it says, he was thirsty, he was lonely, he was in pain, and for 20 years that was the only manual that showed up. She paused, letting the silence weigh. The state is correct. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, but what they've built is a highway for good intentions to drive straight into a brick wall of bureaucracy, leaving millions of Arthurs and Dorothys in the ditch. We are not asking you to throw away the manual. We are asking you to make room for the human heart. Judge Parsons took a week to deliberate. The respite house operated under temporary stay. Dorothy waited, exhausted. Michael waited, pouring his energy into the lobbying effort. Then the call came. The judge had reached a decision. In a 30-page ruling, Judge Parsons did something extraordinary. He dismissed the state's case against Dorothy. He didn't just rule on technicalities. He wrote a searing indictment of the system. The law, he wrote, must have a soul. When it is used to punish compassion that fills a void created by the law's own failures, it ceases to be justice. He found that the state's regulations, as applied in this case, created an unconstitutional burden on Arthur Chen's right to receive care necessary to sustain life. It was a landmark ruling. It didn't change the law statewide, but it set a powerful precedent. The publicity from the case breathed life back into the Arthur Chen Act. Facing overwhelming public pressure, the Legislative Committee passed it. 6 months later, it was signed into law. The Arthur Chen House for Respite Care became a model. It now operates with a hybrid model, licensed nurses working alongside trained, informal caregivers like Dorothy. It has a waiting list of families and a roster of volunteers. Dorothy runs it with a quiet authority, her office wall adorned with photos of Arthur and the hundreds of caregivers who have passed through. Michael Chen sold his company. He now runs a foundation dedicated to caregiver support and legal reform. He and Dorothy speak together at conferences, an unlikely duo bound by grief, guilt, and a shared mission. He visits his father's grave every week. He brings flowers, and he always brings a second set for Dorothy to place. The story seemed complete, a victory snatched from the jaws of a vengeful system, but there was one final, surprising detail. A year after the law passed, the firm managing Arthur Chen's original estate was closing old files. A junior associate found a sealed envelope in the safe behind the will. It was addressed to my children if you are reading this. It had been written by Arthur 5 years before his death and witnessed by his original lawyer who had since passed away. Michael, Lisa, and David, who was notified but did not respond, were sent copies. The letter was not angry, it was resigned. Arthur wrote about his loneliness, his pride in their success, and his sadness at their absence, but the final paragraph was directed elsewhere. To the person who is with me now reading my journal, caring for me, you who are not my blood but have become my breath, I see you. I know my children may challenge what I leave you, they may call you a stranger, but you are the only one who stayed, so I leave you one more thing beyond the house, beyond the money, I leave you my voice. In the bottom drawer of my desk, taped underneath, is a key. It opens a safe deposit box at First Mercantile Bank, box number 714. In it is the truth, use it if you need to, and thank you for remembering me. Dorothy and Michael went to the bank together. The box contained 2 items. The first was a stack of stock certificates for a startup tech company Arthur had quietly invested in 25 years ago. They were now worth $28 million. The second was a short, handwritten codicil to his will, properly notarized, leaving this specific asset to my caregiver, Dorothy Miller, without condition or caveat, free from the claims of my estate or my heirs. Arthur had known, he had known his children might try to take the house. He had hidden this final asset, this fortune, as a failsafe for Dorothy. He had given her not just a home, but the means to defend it and to build a life of her own. Dorothy sat in the bank vault and cried, not for the money, but for the quiet, profound understanding it represented. Arthur hadn't just needed her, he had seen her. He had valued her not as a servant, but as a partner in his final journey. She used the money to endow the respite house in perpetuity. She bought a small cottage for herself, and she established a national fund to provide legal defense for other shadow army caregivers facing the same bureaucratic traps. The story of Arthur and Dorothy is not an anomaly. It is the logical endpoint of a system that values contracts over compassion, licenses over love. It reveals the shocking truth that our elder care system runs on the unpaid, unlicensed, and unrecognized labor of millions of Dorothys. And it asks the most uncomfortable question of all: when family fails, who bears the cost, and who gets to call it love? So what does the story of a boss, a gravesite, and a secret caregiver ultimately reveal? It exposes a brutal accounting. We live in a society that meticulously tracks financial debt but renders human debt invisible. We can price a stock portfolio down to the penny, but we cannot price the value of a hand held in the dark, a meal prepared with care, a life sustained not by obligation but by simple, stubborn kindness. Arthur Chen's legacy is no longer just a real estate empire. It is a law that protects the Dorothys of the world. It is a house that gives respite to the exhausted. It is a hidden fortune that finally paid a 20-year debt. But his true legacy is the question he forces all of us to answer. What is the value of a life? Is it the sum of its assets or the sum of its connections? Is it what you build or who remembers how you built it? Michael Chen walks a different path now. The driven CEO who measured success in deals closed now measures it in families helped. He found his father not in the boardroom but in the quiet, painful ledger of absence. And in paying a debt he never knew he owed, he purchased a redemption he never knew he needed. And Dorothy, she still visits the gravesite every week, but now she is never alone. Sometimes Michael joins her. Sometimes it's a caregiver from the house taking a moment of quiet before returning to their own invisible labor. She tends the plot, places the flowers, and remembers the man who saw her when his own children could not. This is not a story with a villain and a hero. It is a story about systems that fail, about love that persists in the cracks, and about the shocking truth that our most essential work is often done off the books in the shadows by people whose names we never know. It asks you to look around. Who in your life is playing Dorothy for someone? Who is playing Arthur, waiting for a connection that never comes? And what ledger are you keeping, perhaps without even knowing it? The Shadow Army is real, it is millions strong, and it is holding our world together one quiet act of care at a time. The question is no longer whether we see them, the question is what we owe them. If this story made you think about the invisible contracts in your own life, about the value of care and the cost of abandonment, then make sure you're subscribed. We tell the stories that others miss, the human dramas hidden in plain sight. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made in boardrooms or banks. They're made at a graveside in the quiet company of a stranger when the hidden ledger of a life is finally fully revealed.